Morning, everybody, and welcome to this morning's meeting of the Police and Crime Committee. Welcome guests, members of the public, and those watching on webcast. Members of the public may wish to follow us on Twitter at London Assembly and take part in the meeting using hashtag Assembly Police and Probation Services. The main item today is Probation Services in London. We've got a few formal pieces of work to do first, if I may. First of all, apologies for absence. Do we have any for today's meeting?
Thank you, Chairman. We have apologies from Assembly Member Badenoch, and Assembly Member Arbour will be substituting for her. And we also have apologies from Assembly Member Dismore.
Okay, thank you very much. Item 2, declaration of interest. As ever, can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2, and again ask any Assembly members whether they have any other disclosable interests that are not so recorded to declare them now, if any at all? No? Thank you so much. Item 3, can I ask the committee to confirm the minutes of the meeting of the committee held on the 9th of February 2017 to be signed by me as a correct record?
Agreed.
Item 4, summary list of actions. Can I ask the committee to note the completed and ongoing actions arising in previous meetings as listed in the report?
Agreed.
Thank you. And item 5, action taken under delegated authority. Can I ask the committee to note the recent action taken by me following consultation with party group leads, namely to agree the scoping for this meeting on probation services in London. Okay. Thank you very much, colleagues. Okay, thank you for that. Now turning to the main part of this morning's meeting, can I very much welcome our guests, some of which are not strangers and some are strangers to this building. So, Tajinder Matharu, Head of Performance and Quality, National Probation Service, London. Welcome. Our very own Sam Cunningham, we had the pleasure of working with at MOPAC, now Acting Director, Integrated Offender Management, MOPAC. Commander Neil Jerome, welcome. Metropolitan Police Service, this is within your portfolio amongst other important matters. Helga Swindenbank, Director of Probation, London Community Rehabilitation Company. Welcome, Helga. And Linda Nimantis, Head of Quality and Performance, London CRC. So, an esteemed panel of guests, and welcome very much. So, as I say, this morning we'll be talking about and discussing probation services in London. So, the first set of questions, which will be mine, will be about the landscape, will be about scene setting, and we'll have more detailed questions further on. Obviously, yesterday we did have an announcement, a very high-level announcement from the Chancellor around devolution. We've got some questions around that later. And obviously, only a few weeks ago, there was a meeting, Justice Matters meeting, which I think, Helga, you were attending in this very chamber, quite possibly, which is helpful to this work that we're doing. So, my very first question, really, to set the scene, this is across everyone, really, or particularly to MPS and CRC, is can you briefly explain the role of your organisation in managing offenders in London? So just so I understand the pleasant relationship, whomsoever wishes to. This is more for you. Yes, please do. Yeah.
So London CRC is responsible for managing low and medium risk offenders in London. We have approximately 30,000 service users on our books at any one time, and 12% of those are women. In terms of the nature of offences that we manage, the top 3 offences of our service users include drug misuse, common assault and malicious wounding, and that's really just to give you a flavour. Do you want me to slow down?
Could you put your...
Okay.
Thank you.
That's really helpful. Yes, we want to hear you, everything you've got to say.
Okay. So the top 3, just to give you a flavour of the nature of the offences that we manage, the top 3 are drug misuse, common assault and malicious wounding. We are contracted service. We are contracted by NOMS. We cover all 32 boroughs, and the nature of the services we deliver include unpaid work, community supervision and through the gate provision. And a number of our services are delivered through a supply chain. So, for example, we work with RISE, which is a mutual who deliver accredited offending behaviour programmes on our behalf.
Okay. Thank you very much. That's a good... Do you want to, Tajinder, do you want to explain how your relationship builds and how that works? Do you want to turn your mic towards you, good, because you've done. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. In terms of National Probation Service, primarily we deliver services to the courts. That's primarily in terms of advice to courts at the pre-sentence stage. So we produce about 2,000 reports a month, pre-sentence reports, and that advises sentences in terms of what sentence they may impose on offenders who've committed a crime. Post-sentence, we assess and allocate each and every one of those cases. So we either retain a selection of those cases, about 20%, so that's high-risk cases, those violence, sexual offenders who are subject to MAPA, for example. We also retain a proportion of foreign national offenders and any other public interest cases. The rest of the cases are assessed and allocated to a provider, so in London CRC, for example. And so that's the court interface, and that's where our first interface with the CRC comes in. Those cases that we retain, so our caseload is about 16,500 right now. It's made up of 10,000 of those are in custody right now. We get a small proportion of community orders every month. They're all high risk, or have committed sexual violent crime. And we manage those cases. We purchase some interventions, so unpaid work is a good example from the CRC in relation to our caseload. And in addition to that, one thing I should mention is we also offer statutory support to victims of crime in line with the Victims Code.
Okay. So we're going to hear a little bit more detail later. So you talked about supporting victims. Can you give us both, from both viewpoints, some idea about what sort of support you give to the offenders who are heading your way? Some detail around that, both of you, if you could. From the offender viewpoint.
Okay, so we could probably take it in sections. So in terms of unpaid work, that's really about discharging the duty of the court, and we will supervise people's unpaid work hours in the community, doing through a number of routes, through probably people working in groups or working individually in charity shops, that kind of thing. So that's pretty straightforward. Through the gate activity happens when people are in custody, and so we serve London prisoners in custody, and we do that through the male estate and through in the women's estate. So all three women's prisons on the fringes of London we have a presence in, and we're working with women as they come into custody initially. We help assess them and then help prepare them for release, and then signpost them into the community.
We've got some questions about female offenders later.
So that's that bucket of activity, and then the third bucket of activity is the activity that happens in the community. So our offender managers will meet service users regularly, talk to them about their offending behaviour, and again signpost them into activity into interventions in the community if those aren't not interventions that we provide for them.
Okay, and
it's not dissimilar. So in terms of cases that go into custody, they'll all be allocated a responsible officer and offender manager in the community. In general, they'll all have a sentence plan, an annual sentence plan, and that's planning for their time in custody in terms of what rehabilitative activities they manage to undertake to reduce their risk, and also ready them for release whenever that may be. And similarly, with those cases that are in the community, they will be allocated an offender manager who will assess their risk and manage that. So we'll put together a risk management plan and obviously work with partners in terms of police colleagues, health colleagues, whoever it might be, in order to manage that risk in the community and reduce it where possible.
This is when the offenders are obviously in the community. And that's what was kind of interesting. The next sort of kind of question will be around that, and I'll bring the Met in as well, is how do you three kind of groups work together to manage the offenders then when in the community, and what sort of support is around that? So I'll ask all your opinions on that as well. Commander, do you want to comment on the Met's role in that relationship?
Yeah, thank you. So there's three main ways which we work with partners to reduce reoffending. The first is through our MAPA arrangements, which are clearly set out as a statutory arrangement. The other is through our youth offending teams, which again is a statutory arrangement. And lastly, through our integrated offender management teams, which is non-statutory. It's not laid down in legislation, but we do know that through the evidence that dealing with a small number of recidivist offenders, those individuals who are committing a higher number of offences, that we can reduce offending overall. There are other areas that we work with partners, for example, with some of our gang individuals to prevent them from reoffending, as well as domestic abuse perpetrators, and there are particularly with regards to female offenders as well.
Okay. Helga, do you want to add to?
Yeah, so we work collaboratively with all the agencies in London at every level, so both at borough level, local council level, all the way up to pan-London level. And as my colleague from the Met described, we work through IOM, we work through safeguarding, and so we have very strong relationships across London.
But this is a transitional period. I mean, that is actual word. It's transforming rehabilitation. In 2014, there's identified a change. Indeed, after April, there's going to be further changes in the National Police matter. We've got some questions around that later. So there's a sense that there's a lot of change, and change probably means that there was issues and are continuing issues. And again, we've got some questions around London North a little bit later. But that suggests that there might be or has been some points or friction points where offenders may kind of, between the different organisations, fall between the cracks. What's your comments around that? That it has been the case, and how do you address, as three organisations, how do you address that?
So from my perspective, I think it's probably important to note that the transforming rehabilitation agenda was deliberately disruptive, and certainly at the time when the then Secretary of State was talking about the policy, he wanted to shake things up and generate an environment for innovation. So that was a deliberate intent, and those of us working in this field have worked very hard to try and retain frontline services consistently, whilst managing this significant change plan and change programme that we're all working through. And that has been a significant challenge, being able to maintain relationships and retain our focus on the service users whilst still undergoing this kind of structural change. And we're still in it, so we're still embedding our operational model, we're still embedding our performance, and we'll talk about the inspection later. And we're not quite there yet. Certainly from my perspective, it's going to take at least another 12 months before we get ourselves into a steady state position and things feel a lot more stable. But in the meantime, what's really important is that we maintain relationships across agencies and across sectors.
Yeah, I mean, we've got questions around the change in the UK network, particularly you're here also kind of representing or speaking for and with NOMS. Did you want to comment on that?
No, I think the National Probation Service had a similar but a different journey,
yes.
In terms of going from 35 probation trusts to being one national service. And so our focus has been over the last couple of years to harmonise that service delivery nationally, but recognising that there is still a need for some local autonomy. And I think it's trying to find that balance between that. But our primary role in terms of, as a senior leadership team in London has been to protect frontline staff from that activity as much as possible, so they can focus on service delivery. But there are real challenges there, and some of that will come out in the HMIP inspection, and it's really trying to refocus our energies.
Okay, and lastly for me, bring in MOPAC and Samantha in. I mean, what role has MOPAC in checking and monitoring performance across the two partnership organisations? Well, how does MOPAC intervene and control?
So obviously MOPAC doesn't have any formal operational or performance management role at the moment over the CRC. That contract is managed through the MOJ. It's on a national level at the moment, and I'm sure you'll come back to the devolution point later. What I would say though is we have a significant responsibility strategically around partnerships in London, and most importantly about the delivery of the police and crime plan. And currently within the draft, we're very clear that seeing a shift from the criminal justice system, which suffers in part from some of those elements of siloed working into a service, both for offenders and victims, is a kind of mayoral priority. From my perspective, we have very productive relationships with each three of the organisations. We have a formal statutory role around victims and victims commissioning, and of course there is alignment and linkage between what happens with offenders and what happens with victims in London. We're also jointly commissioning on programmes of work around prolific offenders and female offenders in London at the moment, which has been part of that kind of pragmatic approach in terms of our commissioning, and predominantly but not solely working with the CRC has been what's underpinned getting to the point of a successful devolution discussion with central government recently. So we don't have a formal performance management role as it is. We do have agreement that we are starting to have performance meetings with the CRC and the MOJ as of next month to start to open up the contract, so that from my perspective I can understand how we support the CRC and the MPS in terms of that improvement and those plans around transition, which, as Helga said, are still ongoing since the beginning of TR.
I mean, the previous Deputy Mayor, we held MOPAC challenges that Keith Prince and I attended. We had partners with the criminal justice system, there's aspiration. The Mayor's emerging police and crime plan has some very ambitious comments and aims around that same subject, and you heard that the Chancellor made some very high-level agreements at a Concordat yesterday, which we are very keen to find more detail. But my last point really is that the London Crime Reduction Board did establish a while back London Reoffending Board that was chaired by MOPAC, and according to my briefing, that's not met since 2015, and the London Crime Reduction Board doesn't seem to be meeting anymore. That seems rather...
The London Crime Reduction Board last met in November last year.
Okay.
And the next meeting, I'm sorry, I haven't got the dates in front of me,
No,
the
no,
next
go on.
meeting is the beginning of April. The London Reducing Reoffending Board, all of my colleagues at the table attend, and that
Yes.
meets quarterly and has met quarterly
Right.
at every point in the last 2 years. And at the moment it's chaired by myself. I'd actually say it's a very productive board.
Good,
I'm not sure whether comments would be given from my colleagues, but my opinion is we have got ourselves as a partnership in London to be able to support the challenges that have come from that transition, because there are challenges both around how the contracts work, but also about how broader partners in London support the work of the CRC and the MPS. So it has been meeting every 3 months, and will continue to do so.
So it's alive and kicking, but according to the MOPAT, whoever runs the MOPAT website, that revered, auspicious website, there's no detail whatsoever. And the last set of minutes was March 2015. So all this wonderful work you're doing goes
I will pick that up.
unnoticed.
I apologise for that.
Goes
I will pick that
unnoticed by Londoners,
Transparency.
which is rather odd. So that, again, as Caroline's pointed out,
That's very helpful.
there's issues around transparency. Okay, well, thank you.
I will
Thank you
pick that up.
If you could pick that up on
Yeah.
there. So we've got some questions now around performance. Len, did you want to take up the next
Yes, if I can.
set?
Let's turn to a question, and I really think it's to the MPS people. So, can I just begin with, because I think transforming rehabilitation, is it too early to judge how it's going? But there's been some interim results, is that true? In terms of that, so what how does it compare to other areas, and what's the current thinking of the interim results that have been produced?
Okay, so I think you're absolutely right. It's too early to
speak up a bit now.
You're absolutely right. It's too early to call. Our contract tracks cohorts of offenders across a 12-month period and a 6-month time lag. So basically we're judging people across an 18-month time frame, and the first full set of results won't be out until October of this year, and we're waiting those eagerly. You're right to point out that there's been an interim report. It's heavily caveated in terms of the quality of data. In relation to where London sits on that report, it's pretty much mid-table, so you've kind of got Durham at the top end of that table in terms of reducing reoffending rates, Merseyside at the bottom, and we're pretty much mid-table.
Okay, and so, parts of the scheme, are we in a position, even though, so that's on the data, but in terms of the overall scheme and elements of it, is there an interim report about what's working well and what's not working well?
Well, we would probably judge our performance based on NOM's published data around our service level measures. Those are currently being reviewed and being discussed by NOMs about the what they're measuring. They're very much input focused. So, for example, how the length of time it takes to complete a sentence plan. So, very much input rather than output focus. So, it's difficult to tell from the service level measures that we submit monthly whether or not that's having an actual impact on reducing reoffending.
Okay.
I should ask my MPS colleague to come in here.
You're absolutely right that the proven reoffending, there are interim figures out, but they are heavily caveated. And I could easily sit here and say, one of the things we need to try and understand, and I don't know right now, is how the CRCs and MPS cohorts should look, how you compare the two, and you can't compare the two anyway. But we're going to, previous historic data will be the whole probation cohort. Now it will be two different organisations. What should it look like? I don't know. London MPS region does look slightly better than other parts of the country, but it's I've planted that seed, but I wouldn't say that we can rely on that until we get some interim data in October. I've been in many meetings in the last couple of months talking about how this is going to be measured. It's a beast in itself, the reoffending stuff. But what we do have, we know what the quality, we know what the evidence is around reducing reoffending and recidivism. We know what the quality indicators are, and it's those things that we can rely on. And not just the HMRP, the operational assurance, what we do ourselves in-house in terms of building quality and effective practice. The MPS is about to establish a division in itself, an effective practice division, which shows our commitment to effective practice. And those things will give indicators, but yeah, absolutely, the bottom line will always be, I think, reducing reoffending, but it is way too early to tell right now.
And I suppose it's too early to tell in terms of to see if government policy or vision for the probation service is being met at this stage. Would that come in October? When is it fair for someone like me to start looking at and saying from when the government changed the system for to make a judgment? Should I be waiting for October or should I be waiting for a longer period of time?
October will give us the 2015 cohort of offenders. Now that again, so it will give you an early indication of how the impact TR did or did not have. But I think that again, it's heavily caveated with that's the first year of first contract year. It's with all the changes that you described earlier, the organisations are going through. I think it will be, at least 3 years worth of data we would need to really ascertain what impact there has been, if any. And the other thing to say that even with the current reoffending statistics that are published, they do show a reduction overall in general. And it's not going up. It's not going significantly down, but it's there or thereabouts.
But, a reduction down to 2005, 2006 levels, it's pretty constant, isn't it? I mean, you were going up slightly and then it's now coming down. Do you think that trend is going to be continuing then? Are you expecting on the next round of figures to continue to go down? Are you hope for it? But are you telling me it's going down and there's a trend there? Because it does look fairly consistent.
Yeah, hopeful is perhaps the best way to describe it. I would expect it to, what we'd really want to see, I think, is a significant drop. But it's caveated with a number of things. We aren't the sole individual responsible for reoffending rates. And the other thing to remember is these statistics only focus on the cohort of community cases. They don't take into, in terms of what's attributed to probation services, licensed cases, prison cases don't count. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done to understand this. And I think we need to work together to understand it a lot better than I think we currently do.
So, if I'm going to make a judgment at this moment in time, is it work in progress or is it fantastically going really well and we're on the right track?
Work in progress.
It's worth reflecting on the National Audit Office kind of 2015 report, which talks about transforming major transformation projects. They did an assessment of major government transformation projects across government, and they came up with a number of lessons learned. I think TR is probably one of the most complex, ambitious change programs that any of us around this side of the table have ever lived through. And a number of warnings they made was they say this will take time, so kind of 3 to 4 years is not an unrealistic amount of time to bed in new change. And it also talks about kind of banking benefits too soon. So I think to your point, a year is too soon. I think what's coming out is really interesting, and we need to learn, and we need to pull out the learning from the data that's coming out. But 12 months is too soon. From my perspective, and the level of organisational change that I'm leading my organisation through, I think it will take at least 3 to 4 years before we start to see the real genuine results. What I would say is that contractually we are incentivised to reduce reoffending, so we're absolutely focused on what's working, and we're really keen to pull out the lessons learned and to make sure that we operationalise those and we feed that into day-to-day practice, so it is having an impact on reducing reoffending on the front line.
Okay, let's turn to the Met. So in terms of the reforms that have made, can you just outline what changes have been made in the way that you carry out your work? So you mentioned earlier, I think specifically want to home in on IOMs, but you mentioned the 3 areas, I think, from MAPA to the middle ones I'm lost, and then we went on to the non-statutory
youth offending teams.
Youth offending teams. So
Yes.
what changes have the Met proposed in the way that they work responding to this change in the way probation's worked? What can you paint us a picture?
Indeed. At the MAPA level, so that's dealing with those offenders who are of the highest risk of reoffending, be that through violence or sexual reoffending. There's a MAPA coordinating office for London, of which the Met plays a very key part of that. There's a number of subgroups which the Met plays, again, a key part of those subgroups to look at how do we manage those offenders and reduce their reoffending. The youth offending teams is an established process. There's been very little change in terms of how they operate. The IOM is the one which is non-statutory, and that operates across all of the London boroughs. There is always going to be local variation between each of those boroughs. What we're trying to do is bring a consistency in terms of how we operate across those boroughs, but there's always a balance there between how do you operate consistently across London whilst recognising that the crime profile in boroughs is going to be different. The arrangements within each local authority area is going to be different as well. So we're trying to ensure that there's a coordination and consistency across the Met in terms of how we operate, but also recognising that that is an alliance of different bodies, and moving forward, and it was still in those early stages of just ensuring there is that consistency, so that when we do measure the performance, it is a consistent performance across the Met, and we're able to deliver that consistency of service whilst balancing against that local difference.
Can we just try and understand why this variation exists? So what is it? Is it down to staffing and borough staffing and what's allocated? Is it down to the crime profile?
Yeah.
Tell us where this is, and paint us a picture in terms of no one wants to target boroughs, but saying the difference between, is it an inner and outer thing? You know, is it suburban versus that? Well, fine. Explain this variation.
It's not. So the factors that are at play are, firstly, for MAPA and for the youth offending teams, there's a clear statutory framework laid down and set out in terms of how they would operate. There isn't that for IOM. It's left to each area to determine how it's going to operate. So there isn't that statutory framework, firstly. Secondly, there is an issue with staffing in terms of the consistency of staffing and the turnover of individuals that are working locally. Relationships are built upon that consistency, and with a high turnover of staff, that clearly is a challenge. Then there's also the changes in terms of the local service provision. So you will find some local authorities will be commissioning services through non-statutory sector, and will be engaging with those different agencies to provide support services for offenders. Others won't be investing in terms of that provision. You'll also got a difference in terms of crime profile as well. So there'll be some boroughs that will be more focused in terms of gang activity, and there'll be others that will be focused more in terms of some of the high volume prolific offending, such as burglary, vehicle crime.
It's the first time I've heard on this committee, I mean, I'm a regular attender and I might have missed one or two, for a police officer to tell me about a non-statutory service, which I think is honesty, do you know what I mean, in terms of saying, well, actually, this is how it is, but a service that has such an impact in terms of fighting crime, which goes back to one of the first issues about the reason why we deal with reoffending is prevention around on it. Is there a document you can point to us that's public, or if not it's public, but certainly we could have access to, that tells us what advice you're giving to boroughs about operating the IOM service? Do you know what I mean? Is there something that says, this is the advice, this is the toolkit, this is how you should do it if you want to do it? Because isn't the issue, again, from sort of the many years of listening to issues around territorial policing and the role in the terms of the boroughs, that actually, even though it's a non-statutory service, the issue of consistency is this is not about whether you can or not, this has to be done. So is the Met planning to say that to the boroughs at some stage, that at some form or another, depending on the variations that may exist there, you have to do the following around this type of service? Whether it's the Christmas card to all the burglars to say, actually, Merry Christmas to you, and we're watching you, is minimum approach to a bit more sophisticated. Was it Diamond was one of the projects Diamond. Of targeting wards and clusters, and actually making it a bit heavy at the other end of the spectrum. What is it the Met's doing here, to be honest?
So, we do set out how each of the boroughs will operate from an MPS point of view in terms of how we expect our officers to go about discharging the RM function locally. There's a range of tactics. Sending Christmas cards is one. There is not a menu of tactics which are laid out, and in these circumstances you use these. We allow officers to have their own professional discretion in how they deploy that. So there is a consistency across the Met in terms of how we expect each of our boroughs to operate. Where the inconsistency is because you will find in some boroughs that they'll have a particular focus on a particular crime type that will be different to a neighbouring borough. You'll expect that. You'll also find that there will be some boroughs who will be investing more in terms of the support that they will give, and there will be others that won't. So there's a consistency across the Met in terms of how we will operate internally, and what we need to work through is how do we encourage our partners to engage at that same level.
And where is this thinking? I mean, should there not be advice? I mean, in terms of training now, reduced numbers of assets that you've got, should there not be advice to a borough commander and a senior management team saying, actually, this is a range of options you've got. You should be considering these throughout the year, determine on that, to drive down this reoffending issues. I'm surprised by that. I mean, you know, not saying the question of the leaders, but, you know, as a local government practitioner, we used to get all sorts of advice from the Audit Commission. I know it's now gone, and they're left to flounder. But, you know, why isn't there that advice, and why isn't there that toolkit, someone doing that and pushing from the centre about driving down reoffending rates?
Yeah. So there's a range of what I would term standard tactics that you would use in terms of those individuals. So home visits, conducting surveillance operations on those individuals where the intelligence determines that, a whole range of different tactics that we'd use. You'll also find, and so those are well established. You'll also find that there will be tactics which I would deem to be more innovative and off the wall. So the Christmas cards is that when it was first introduced was innovative and slightly off the wall. I think it's probably now a little bit more mainstream. You have to be careful around how you use that because there is only a very short shelf life to it. But in terms of allowing our officers to have that professional discretion with that professional knowledge and those tactics, so it might be hotspot targeting, it might be surveillance operations, there'll be a whole range. We don't have those written down in a manual for officers to use. We rely on their professional discretion, their professional knowledge and their training to implement whatever tactic they think is suitable for those particular individuals.
Okay, so you had an HMI report, I think it was the Peel report, that said about your inconsistency around that. Is there a time when there's an expectation that somehow that inconsistency is going to go then? What's the thinking about that? Or is it always you think it's... Because I just want to read you what they said about your inconsistency, and then you tell me whether there's something structural that inconsistency is okay. So they say, when they came in and saw you and looked at what you were doing, the implementation of these changes are being left to individual boroughs without being coordinated from the centre, and were leading to inconsistencies in both resourcing and the criteria for offenders that should be managed. Is that then what you're saying to us, that there will always be an inconsistency, and in some ways we might want to celebrate that, or we're not really going to be driving down the figures in the way that we want?
Yeah. So there does need to be a greater degree of consistency across the boroughs in terms of how we operate, in terms of how we measure, but there will always be, and this is the balance between recognising the unique characteristics of each borough as well. So what we don't want to do is be in a position where we constrain and one size fits all. So you need to have that local flexibility to reflect local crime, local priorities, what the public are telling us in terms of what is important to them, but at the same time ensuring there's a consistency across London in terms of how we deliver that. And that's where we need to work on in terms of making sure we've got that consistency, but it does not constrain that local flexibility for local priorities.
Okay. In the, I think for the committee, we've also been working on the borough mergers issue, which we think poses a number of challenges to the Met, and almost inconsistency could become the new mantra of the Met in terms of some of those issues. Are you involved in the very process of borough mergers, and where does this fit in to one of the many things the Met has to achieve, area or whatever we decide to call the new merged boroughs? Is this going to be an important issue, and is this not an opportunity to get more consistency in then?
I would agree with you. Yes, it is that opportunity.
And are you grasping it?
And we are, and I am linked in, my team are linked in to ensure that there is that consistency across each of the merged boroughs.
Okay, right, because that would be very useful if you could provide some evidence to this committee about that and the input you're doing on some mergers. Can I just ask a quick question to Mopac? So where do you fit into this then? What do you think of the inconsistency in the Met, and what are you saying about that in terms of your conversations with the Met?
In terms of integrated offender management programmes, I think there's two things really. Firstly, just to support Neil's perspective, we have to have the flexibility. So the fact that IOM is not a statutory requirement on any of the partners around the table at IOM meetings means inevitably that we will get inconsistency across the 32 boroughs. From MOPAC's...
I mean, I do want to, on record, much that I'm being very nice and reasonable in the way I'm asking questions, I don't think I accept that. I've not heard, albeit you've exchanged with me, that there is an element of that we should accept the inconsistency that we've got at the moment, and we should be working to reduce that.
Well, I don't disagree that we should be working to reduce it. I think there's 2 points there. There's the point about the inconsistency of the tactical response to the offenders, and then there's the point about the inconsistency of how the partners come together in each of the 32 boroughs and which partners are proactively or not proactively engaged in those arrangements. So I don't disagree that we shouldn't be looking to reduce the inconsistency of both of those points. I think tactically, just to agree with Neil, my experience is that although that's not written down, there are very consistent elements of tactical intervention from the police around repeat offenders, and the work between the MPS and the CRC and the NPS is generally consistent, albeit there's a number of different tactics that might be used. I think where we need to look to drive down the inconsistency is about the prioritisation of reducing reoffending at a local borough level. And that's one of the challenges that have come with TRs. There's a connection directly between the sort of previous set of questions around probation services and the changes that they've gone through, and with IOM meetings locally. Because they're not required on a statutory footing in each of the boroughs, as safeguarding boards are or community safety partnership boards are, there is a choice there for local partners as to whether they come around the table to work together or not. Now, in the main, my experience is that the majority of London partners and in each of the boroughs do come together to bring their resources together to think about how they reduce reoffending. That is different and an extension of the tactical operational tools used by the MPS. We do need to look to drive down those inconsistencies and to promote integrated offender management as a good way of working at a local level. A lot of work has been done, and just to go back to your previous question, there is some documentation both from the Home Office, which in my personal view is out of date at the moment, and an operational guidance tool for London that was drafted about 3 years ago around what good practice looks like from an IOM perspective in a local borough. So not so much about the tactical deployment from the MPS perspective, but how should the meeting run, who should be there, what do we mean when we talk about pathways to reduce reoffending, and what and how do local authorities contribute to that. My view is that through the changes that have happened with probation services, inevitably what's happened is that some of those non-statutory partnerships have suffered as a result of those changes because it's unprecedented in terms of the level of change. My view is that that's getting back on track a lot more now, and the changes that have been put in place through the CRC's recent improvement plan have seen some of those local partnerships starting to come back together in a much stronger way. So we do need to reduce the inconsistencies, and we also need to continue to support local authorities to be at the table and to be engaged in offering some of those pathways out of crime. From MOPAC's perspective, we fund out of the London Crime Prevention Fund a number of different IOM coordinators and commission services at within different boroughs to support those programmes. And through the police and crime plan, it will be one of the priorities to look at how we continue to work with London boroughs to provide that support.
Am I right in thinking then there's a priority? MAPA, you can't afford to drop the ball,
No.
so you have to in a statutory. On the issues of the youth offending teams, there's going to be some very advanced work there about reoffending and targeting, probably more so than probably any other area. This is a priority then. But in that priority of offending, shouldn't it be a number one target for some fresh thinking, maybe, is about those who cause violence? So, you know, I'd imagine that, you know, start off at 10, domestic violence, reoffending can lead to, you know, murder unless there is a proactive, preventative approach. And there may well be sophisticated partnerships at borough level, and there will be some inconsistency about resourcing that from the non-policing elements of those issues. But what I don't get a feel of is, well, you know, I mean, I think burglaries, you know, people that do burglaries it's pretty horrific crime, you know, violation of someone's space and their possessions in some senses. But, you know, I don't get a feeling there's any target, even in the non-statutory, of trying to drive down and do the prevention for us in terms of making us safe, to the others. So where's that thinking coming from? If we've got the Met doing the day-to-day job, shouldn't that bill be MOPAC?
And I think we've been quite clear, certainly in the draft police and crime plan at the moment, we've got 4 priority cohorts that we've outlined within that plan. One is prolific offenders, which is generally, not exclusively, but generally where repeat burglars, for example, would sit. That sort of grouping in a borough where you would think of, you know, repeat acquisitive crime, within prolific offenders, that's generally where that cohort would sit. So we've been really clear that actually there's a very small number of offenders in London compared to our overall offenders that cause significant harm to communities and to victims. And I think we're really clear that we want to continue to work with partners across London to focus resources and co-commission around that. It's from 2 perspectives on that. Firstly, we're currently invested in working with the CRC on an enhanced programme of support around prolific offenders in 8 boroughs in the north east of London to trial different interventions to see if that makes a difference and to think about how we support those local IOM arrangements. And secondly, that in terms of focusing on prolific offenders is underpinning some of the conversations we're having with the MOJ at the moment about how do you target some of what are quite limited resources to have the biggest impact on victims and Londoners more generally in terms of reducing reoffending. And then the other 3 priority areas, we've talked in the draft police and crime plan around young offenders, but also about young adults, so those that transition from the youth estate into the adult estate, and the problems that that causes. Often it happens behind closed doors, that transition. So what the Met receive out of the system is something different to what went in. So there's a challenge around how we work around that. And thirdly, around female offenders. So we're really, really clear that in terms of how we work with female offenders as a whole group, not just the prolific ones, we need to think differently about the solutions and the interventions to support a reduction in reoffending. And we recently launched and have invested in our working with the CRC around bespoke solutions to improving the quality of the casework, but also interventions to support that. So I think we're quite clear that that cohort approach is really important because, you know, there's 40,000 offenders, probably haven't got the right number, but a significant number of offenders in London. We suffer from volume. We need to think about how do we work together to target those cohorts where we know we can have the most significant impact.
We need to move this on, but I think, Sian, you've got a question.
Just a quick question to the Met about the youth offending services, because you say they're statutory.
They are.
But are you seeing inconsistencies across boroughs, changes within boroughs, where they were going above the statutory minimum? I've seen boroughs who, for example, cut back on the services they give to first-time offenders because of targeting their resources on people with more problems.
There is a far more greater degree of consistency with youth offending teams. There's always going to be a variation from borough to borough, but there is largely a consistent service delivery across the Met in terms of those youth offending teams.
Are you seeing a general reduction of any kind as things are being cut back?
I think it's difficult to say at this stage.
Okay, we're monitoring that closely, I think.
Okay, thank you very much.
If
Now move.
Sorry, Steve, I was just saying that if it's helpful just to say that in terms of the cuts from YJB in the last 3 years, there have been significant cuts from national funding into youth offending services, and so we will be seeing a reduction, and we are seeing that reduction across London in terms of the enhanced services.
Okay, all right. Anyway, the next set of questions is around the recent performance report around London CRC and NPS, which was pretty damning, in fairness, and I think we need to explore that. So, Peter, you've got a question around that.
Good morning. Yes, as the Chairman said, it's around the report that came out in December. Dame Glenys Stacey. It actually stated that the probation situation was actually putting people at risk. I mean, what is your view on that? What is your thought on the report generally?
Shall I start? Certainly we acknowledge the report, acknowledge many of the findings in the report, and have done an awful lot of work since the inspection took place, which happened in August of last year. So we've had a number of months now to address our performance and to put performance plans in place. The question around, and so probably about 6 themes emerged for us from that report, one of which was around the at-risk question. So, but all linked. So, for example, she was critical of the quality of the work that was taking place in London. She was critical of caseloads, of poor oversight, of service users not complying with their sentence, of our cohort, our operating model, and also the relationship with the MPS. What I would say is that that London has a history of poor performance, and so I think whilst we absolutely take seriously and are doing an incredible amount of work to put right the findings of the report, reports from 2009 onwards have been critical about the provision of probation services in London. So this is
Shouldn't
part
really
of a history.
derive any comfort from that, should we?
No, not at all. I think the point is that London has a legacy of poor performance, is an incredibly complex environment to work in. I think the report also talks about the work of probation services being unrelenting. 17% of the services, of probation delivery happens in London. So I think I just wanted to put it into that context. But that's not me making excuses. And we have done an awful lot of work in London CRC to put right the findings of Dame Glenys.
I think the thing is that when the report says putting people at risk, I mean, that's about as damning as you can get.
Yes, yeah.
I mean, considering that is your very point.
Yes. So the work I can talk you through some of the activity that we've put in place to address some of those concerns. So in terms of the quality of work, we have undertaken a considerable amount of work with our staff team. We've gone through performance management approach to the staff team, have put training in place to uplift standards. One of the other contributing factors to the concerns raised was around caseloads. So she reflected that there were some very, very high caseloads in London, and we now have an average caseload of 55, which is making our offender managers' work much more manageable, and they're able to meet and manage their service users in a way they weren't able to do in August of last year. In terms of poor oversight, I've done some significant restructuring within my senior management team, and we've also bought, we've got enhanced management information, so we are now tracking absolutely everything that comes through the London CRC, including service user compliance. And we now know exactly the status of each of the 30,000 cases that we sit on, and we know where they are and who they're being seen by, and we are able to flag where there are concerns. We've done some work looking at our operating model. So we had implemented at the beginning of last year a cohort model based on criminogenic needs. So we had 5 cohorts within London probation. We'd kind of moved away from an area-based structure into clustering our service users into a women's cohort, young adult males, mental health cohorts and so on.
Can I just, sorry, it's very interesting. But could I just sort of say, again, really emphasise this point? I mean, the report said that it found a simple, unacceptable lack of management attention to whether offenders turned up to appointment. I mean, turned up to appointments, and whether their offending behaviour was being challenged. I mean, right at the very heart of it. I mean, maybe could I ask you, Tatiana, what you made of the report. I mean, it's all very well to start sort of mending your ways now, but I mean, this is extraordinary, isn't it? This is dire.
Slightly different technique. In terms of the MPS, what the inspectorate found, I mean, I've got my notes here from the day we met before
Yeah.
the report was published, and then described it as mixed, and we accept it is mixed. Most of the public protection work we undertook was found to be sufficient, but I'm not for a minute saying that there's not too much of it, which is how they described it. There's still too much that is not up to standard, and we completely accept that. And you're absolutely right, we can put things in place retrospectively, but I mean, that narrative paints a picture, but I think that I would get into the detail of it. We spoke about MAPA earlier. There were 6 MAPA cases in the sample, and there were only 21 cases in the sample from the MPS. It's important to have that context. And 5 out of those 6 cases were found, those MAPA arrangements were found to be sufficient or more. And what they did point out was some confusion between MAPA and IOM, the statutory versus non-statutory, how we manage that. And I think the reason I think it's important for us and our staff on the front line to build on those positives going forward and not focus on just on those. There's good work out there, and there always has been, and it's how we build on that good work as opposed to just focusing on what the negatives might be. But you're absolutely right. There is too much work, and
It's a total failure, isn't it?
I don't think I'd accept it as a total failure, because I think when you look into the detail, there is some good work in there.
How do you, Helga, Tajinta, how do your bodies, as it were, actually, what is the interface like? I mean, how do you work together, and particularly in addressing all these myriad problems? How does that work?
Yeah. Okay. So we have formal meetings where we interface. So we have which are set out in our contract, and we have shared obligations to meet both at a very senior level and going down the organisation. And what supports that are growing informal relationships. So I have a very strong informal relationship with the Deputy Director of MPS responsible for London, and I meet with her regularly. And members of my senior team meet with their counterparts, and that's supported by a number of activities that we're sharing. So, for example, sharing training, sharing conversations and processes around performance management. So we're attempting to work together to ensure that we're supporting the delivery of probation services in London.
So just to add, Tajinda and I work very closely because obviously we're counterparts in the 2 organisations, and that's working really well together. So we're addressing a number of the key interfaces. So, for example, we've literally just run training, which was for CRC staff, but we had a member of the MPS come and deliver some of that training, which was incredibly helpful. And that's the kind of manner with which we want to continue working this year.
Do either of you ever think it would actually be much more effective if there was just one body doing this? I mean, is it too many cooks, as it were, spawning a broth?
It might make things more it might make things more simple. However, I'm very excited about what TR allows us to do. So our mission is to reduce reoffending in London, and I think having been kind of removing the shackles of some of the kind of government and having a contract allows us to be much more flexible and allows us to think slightly differently. And so I'm excited about the future. At the moment, it's just incredibly complex, and it's been a really highly complicated change programme that we are all weaving our way through, and we're trying really hard not to impact on the lives of service users and to carry on that really important work while we get ourselves organised and allow ourselves to be able to do the really exciting, innovative, reducing reoffending work that we know that we have the potential to do. But at the moment, we're working through the complexity.
Thank you. I think you did actually go through, didn't you, some of the things you're trying to do?
Yeah.
Can you just pinpoint the two chief ones that you would say? What, without going through like bullet points, what are the main things you're trying to do to change this situation?
Okay, so to address your particular point about risk, I'm going to actually ask Linda, who's been leading on this. So there are 2 areas. One is management information and how we're managing and offering oversight, and then what we're doing around uplifting our staff skill set. And I'll ask Linda to pick up on this, she's leading.
Indeed. So in terms of management information, we have a far more robust process in place now in terms of how we manage service users coming into the office every week and how often they're reporting, making sure that they've got a plan in place, and we have to report back to NOMs who manage our contract. So we have far more robust processes than we did before, and we're continuing to enhance those. And as well, last year, and we started it, and this started before the HMIP report as well, because we recognised that we had a challenge with our performance. We've made a significant investment in our staff. So basically for all of our offender managers in the organisation, we went through a performance and talent management process, and we looked at where are they all performing. And for all of those staff who were not performing to the right standard, they've all been through a significant and extensive training to make sure they're very clear about the foundations of the job and they know what the standards are. So that's something that we're very proud of, in fact, in terms of the training that we've been delivering.
Okay, thank you. Could I just ask Samantha? Hi. What do you think about? I mean, how have you, in your discussions with the Ministry of Justice, how do you think these terrible shortcomings, not just shortcomings, but just it seems that basic failures can be overcome in London?
Yeah, so I think it's important for us to say that there were a number of different conversations before Christmas, both between the Mayor, the Deputy Mayor and Ministers, which were very positive, and some really honest and quite transparent information provided from the CRC and the MOJ around what were the issues, what were those 40 cases that were looked at as part of the HMIP report, and what does the improvement plan look like following that. I don't want to reiterate what Helga said. I think there is a challenge. To me, the challenges are separate. So one at the moment is around the operational performance of probation services in London, which is both the CRC and the NPS, and how they have responded to the significant change programme over the last 2 years, and how that has impacted on their service users. And that is what I think has come through personally through the HMIP report. Secondly, what sits alongside that is, do we have the right arrangements for London in place, which is a different question, to ensure that London is getting the most value out of, for example, the CRC contract, and that the way that the contract is commissioned and managed is in the best interests of London and London's needs. Now, for me, those two questions are different, and we've been quite clear in not aligning the two things. So the outcomes of the HMIP, from my perspective, demonstrate two organisations that have struggled to respond to the change programme through TR. It was immense, it happened very quickly, and what we are seeing is an impact on service users as a result of that. From this officer's perspective, the Deputy Mayor and the Mayor are content that they have had the improvement plan explained to them in a way that makes sense, and that they are content that the CRC and the NPS are working together to put those improvements and required immediately changes in place. Alongside that is a different question, which is Helga's point that there is a legacy of poor performance around probation services in London, and whether or not the current arrangements through TR and the way that the contract is managed sits in the best place to ensure that London gets what it needs. So one of the things that you as a committee have asked lots of questions about this morning is how these three organisations work together to manage those offenders in London. There is a big opportunity through the Mayor's Office, which currently has formal oversight with the Met, to think about what that should look like for CRC probation services in London, and how could these two organisations be more integrated and managed and commissioned in a different way. That's not going to happen from a national perspective, just because it's too difficult to do. It's not because the MOJ do or don't want to do it, it's just too difficult to do that from a national perspective. So from my point of view, the HMIP report was telling, it was clear, and I think for all of us, probably not that surprising in terms of the impact that TR changes, and let's be honest, financial cost savings exercises have had on provision over the last 2 years. But from this officer's perspective, we are content with the improvement plan that's been put in place. The CRC ran a number, I think it was 2 days, of partnership work with senior strategic partners in London in January, at the end of January, with chief executives, and we were really pleased with the view and the support that came from the London boroughs following those conversations. So I think that the right actions are now in place. I think the challenge is a bigger one, though, which is that we need to think about how is London going to help manage and help to improve those services in the longer term around reoffending, as opposed to what are largely just case-based issues of performance that have come through the HMIP report.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. we've now got sort of questions really about caseload pressures and also some thoughts around devolution. Caroline, did you have?
Yes, yeah. I just before that wanted to pick up. I was just saying, Helga, very carefully to what you're saying, and I accept it must have been very difficult, this change in structure and so on. I used to work in the NHS. I've lived through several reorganisations and the impact that would have on staff morale. But you only said you acknowledge many of the recommendations of the report, so you don't agree with the report.
We agree with the findings of the report. I think the point we made at the time was they looked at 40 cases, so it was 0.1% of our caseload. So I think and it was in an area where we knew we had significant performance problems. So I think that's
So you didn't think it fully reflected the service, but it did reflect the area they looked at?
I think it absolutely reflected the area they looked at, and I think what it allowed us to do is draw out themes and take a look at what was happening across the rest of London, and as Linda's just described, talk to the entire organisation about upskilling.
And has staff morale been an issue going through all this change?
I think staff morale has been really buffeted, not just by the inspection report, but through the whole TR process. I'm relatively new to probation. I joined London CRC in November 2015, and I arrived at a time where staff were grieving the split between the MPS and between the CRC, and they have been through an awful lot. And part of our job as a senior team is to say, okay, we've got a change plan in place, we're really optimistic about the future, and these are the things we're doing to try and fix it. But yeah, staff have been pretty buffeted over the last few years around TR and the consequences of it.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to talk about caseload. Now, the December inspection highlighted that individual probation officer caseloads range from 50 to 100 cases, and some senior officers were overseeing more than 900 cases, which is unsustainable. And you said now, 2 months on, that your average caseload is 55. Mm-hmm. That still means some people have got up much higher caseload than perhaps they should have.
Yeah, so the inspection took place in August. So as soon as we got the informal feedback from the inspector, we took action around. Actually, we were cognizant of the caseload differentiation prior to that, but we've been working on this since August.
So how are you reducing the caseload? Are you recruiting more because you had a 20% vacancy rate?
Yep. So we've done a number of recruitment and also our operational remodelling. So I'll start with recruitment. We have done a significant recruitment exercise, both looking externally and talking to our agency staff about converting into permanent staff. So that is ongoing, and we're very confident about the outcomes of those who've just done a recruitment exercise. We did some recruitment last week and got some really good quality people, which we're delighted about. And we've also looked at the operational model. So the operational model that we had implemented at the beginning of January 2016 didn't help caseload. So we had a significant disparity. We had some of our offender managers who were managing caseloads of approximately 20, and others in the hundreds. So we've changed the way we do business around, which has allowed us to spread that caseload more evenly, and we do now have an average of approximately 55. There are some slightly higher, but not significantly higher, and things are feeling much more comfortable. I visit an office a week, and what I've been hearing over the last month or two is that people are feeling much more comfortable with their caseloads and much more confident about how they're working with their service users, and thereby mitigating some of the risks that were highlighted earlier.
But what would sort of an ideal sort of best practice sort of work caseload be? What's the sort of, would 40 cases really be more appropriate, or are you saying 55 is absolutely manageable? It sounds a huge amount to me.
Yeah, our view is 55 is manageable. Remember, we're working with low to medium cases, some of whom are still in custody. So our people have a mixed caseload. Linda, do you want to?
Yeah, indeed. So 55 is absolutely manageable, and I think it's remembering that most work takes place in a case in the first 3 months of an order. Mm-hmm. So that is where the work needs to focus. So if you have a foreign offender manager with a caseload of 55, it will be spread across the time frame. So you'll have some cases that are coming up to expiry. So those 55 cases are not all within the first 3 months of the order. So it's very much manageable. And we are very robust with our management information as well, so we are constantly monitoring caseloads, and all of our area managers and senior probation officers are held to account in terms of caseloads, so it's something that we are robustly managing.
Can I just ask, from Tajinder's point of view, what's the sort of caseload, average caseload? Because you've got them more serious, haven't you?
Yeah, so, and it does vary a little bit. The way the caseload is, we've introduced autumn last year a 7-tier system. So each tier of case, depending on the characteristics of the caseload, attracts weighting, and that's how it's worked out. But if an average probation officer was working full-time, and would they'd have around 35, 40 cases tops. But you've got to remember that a lot of that is in prison.
Right, okay.
And very few in custody. But it will vary between officers.
Yeah, no, it's just helpful to get that comparison. In terms of supervision, because that's really important with these cases. I know you talked about you'd brought in enhanced management tracking, you got everything, it's flagging, but actually that supervision of those officers, helping them when they perhaps come to an obstacle with a particular offender, what's the ratio there in terms of cases and supervisors to those staff?
So the average of senior probation officer to offender manager is between 10 and 12 full-time equivalent members of staff. And for each senior probation officer, the expectation is that they're supervising each of their offender managers once a month, so they can go through their caseload and make sure that the foundations of the work that need to be done are being complete. And again, that's something that is manageable and is a key part of a senior probation officer's job.
Seen as a manageable workload
Yes.
as well and caseload?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, so the National Audit Office report talked about there being a significant gap between estimated caseloads that CRCs had used to cost up their bids and actual volumes they're working with. And I think another one had cut frontline employee numbers in line with their work volumes. I know London is different, but do you think the contracts are sustainable due to this gap in predicted and actual caseload volume?
This is a very live debate which is currently being considered by the probation system review. So the Ministry of Justice are conducting a very extensive review across the country into this very question around volumes and associated revenue, and we are contributing to that, and we are waiting anxiously for the outcome to see what the Ministry of Justice will come up with in terms
Is
of
it an issue for you in London? That
we've got a very positive relationship with NOMS, and they are very aware of our organisational challenges. They accept the legacy issues. So the conversations that we're having at the moment is around holding our revenue at a steady state until the outcome of the PSR is announced.
But is the revenue enough to cover the workload you've got?
At the moment we're okay. I mean, I think
Are you different to other regions?
So my hesitation is that a lot of this is very much a commercial conversation, and it's very much in the mix with the probation system review. I mean, at the moment we're okay, and we're working very hard with NOMS to focus on operational delivery.
Okay. And is there an impact from this issue of funding? And obviously you're discussing that up the line in terms of on probation officers and on offenders in terms of what you're able to deliver and provide.
If we don't get a favourable outcome from the probation system review, yes, it will have an impact on our ability to provide the number of staff we'll be able to employ to provide services. So if we don't get a favourable outcome, that will bring lots of things into question.
Wow, that's really quite worrying, isn't it, that you can't afford to run the contract to provide the service you need for the offenders and the volume of offenders?
So we are making very robust representations to NOMS and Ministry of Justice about what we think we need to deliver good quality services to London.
Okay. Right, I'm going to move on to something else, take you out of the hot seat. Let's talk about devolution, and if I can ask Samantha, what does it actually look like? Because we talk about devolution all the time, particularly politicians, we love talking about it. What does a devolved criminal justice service actually look like for London? And what would it actually mean for reoffending rates? What would it actually mean for Londoners, as it were?
Just going to write the reoffending bit down because I'll forget that when I finish talking about what it actually means. So thank you. It's a really helpful question, and I think you're right as well that there's been lots of conversations about devolution for a long time, that devolution will help fix things and it will just improve performance and it will help do away with a lot of the challenges that we've just talked about in terms of funding and contracts. So in the last 4 4 to 6 months, we've been having really good conversations with the MOJ around what criminal justice devolution should or could mean for London. From our perspective, the key priority has been that it doesn't stop things, if that makes sense. So we have got in place, in my view, quite pragmatic and appropriate joint commissioning arrangements at the moment with the CRC, and I want that spirit of pragmatism and addressing the problems to continue and not to be halted by a programme of developing an MOU that takes a long time. So for London, what does criminal justice devolution mean? It means two things really. Firstly, it means agreeing a set, so we have different language around this, so a lot of the conversations will be around language, but it means agreeing a set of joined or aligned priorities. From my perspective, that means what are our co-commissioning priorities over the next 3 to 5 years in terms of criminal justice for London. From the Mayor's Office, we have agreed that we think the priorities for London are around lots of the issues that we've talked about today. So we are very focused on youth justice. For the reasons that have been flagged, resources are reducing. There are challenges around how the National is able to work with London boroughs in that respect, and we would like to bring a stronger partnership together around London for that to jointly invest. Secondly, we're very committed to female offending. The evidence, which is obviously a key component of the MOJ's OS, is clear around female offending, both in terms of the fact that more spend time in prison on shorter sentences than they should, and generally they behave better than males in terms of reducing reoffending and compliance, and therefore we should do something better in London. Thirdly, around prolific offending. And linked to the conversation around prolific offending is what could we be doing differently to keep some of these individuals out of prison for longer periods of time to be able to do rehabilitation work with them. So we've started some interesting work around tagging as an extension of the work we've been doing around sobriety. So we see that use and challenge and testing around tagging as being an important joint piece of work between us and the MOJ. And then fourthly, in terms of co-commissioning, it's looking at the transition points, the point around young adults, and whether or not the way that young adults are treated and supported through the system makes sense. So they're the kind of 4 areas where we want to do joint work. That's not about saying that we want immediately budgets devolved or responsibilities devolved, but we do want commitments around joint work, joint outcomes and joint ambitions so that we can do aligned programmes of work in those areas. And then secondly, it's where second part of what devolution means to us is where we do think the devolvement of services or budgets makes sense in terms of either improvements in performance or quality of services. And the 2 key areas there, one are around what we've talked about, which is around the CRC contract. Our ask at the moment is thinking much more about how we work with the MOJ, so not saying let's lift and shift the contract management and the budget, but let's get some better joint arrangements between national contract management and regional commissioning and contract management so we can help address some of the very pertinent issues that you've raised around funding and what might come out of the probation systems review. And secondly, we are clear that we should be seeking better solutions for victims out of the CJ devolution arrangement for London, and that we have in our gift services that are delivered through the MPS and statutory services that are commissioned through us through the current funding from MOJ, and we would like to be able to expand that so we have a service for victims going into court where we have a direct responsibility of ensuring that pathway and consistency of care, as opposed to what we have at the moment, which is, you know, bump points, quite frankly, for a victim who has to repeat their story or receive different forms of support along the way.
Okay.
Sorry, and what does that mean
I'll
for
come back. I want to
reoffending?
just pick up though on that. So really, it's kind of more softer joint working, whatever. You're not asking for the budgets to be devolved and the management of contracts. You're just wanting a better way in that you kind of jointly
I think it's a combination of those 2 things. So in the first 4 about, we are asking for integration and joint commissioning commitments from the MOJ. In the latter 2 around the CRC contract, we await what happens from the probation systems review because that's important in terms of understanding those questions around funding. But in terms of victims and the victim court service, I think we're quite clear that we think that a devolvement of that service to London makes sense, and that for victims in London that makes sense.
Okay, but you've been looking, and I can't find, I read it in here somewhere the exact time, but you've been looking at devolution for quite a few years, and yet we had the announcement yesterday in the budget, which all it talks about is we'll work together to develop a shared view of the benefits and identify services that can be best delivered locally. It kind of feels that's what you've been doing for several years. Are you kind of disappointed with what came out yesterday, or do you think actually within a few months you're then going to have something firmed up?
No, I'm not disappointed. I think it is a commitment, and what I'm particularly pleased about is that also in the same statement it says a memorandum of understanding will be agreed by June 2017 to support the process for collaborative working.
Yeah.
So from my perspective, it's that memorandum of understanding that's really important, because that's where the detail will sit in terms of how we will work together, what do resources look like and mean, and what areas will be directly devolved and what will be part of collaborative working.
So you expect by June to have in that memorandum, yes, I just see that, that's the next bullet down, that you will have actual real devolution of budgets and services?
I think we will have clear agreements and timeframes. What we won't be able to do, I think it wouldn't make sense to say that at the beginning of next financial year we're going to see budgets devolved. But what we will have by June is a clear timeframe of what those agreements are, which I'm personally quite excited about, and I think is a good shift forward. I also think that we are now in a position to make sure that the work that we have done in the last 2 to 3 years, working jointly together in London to do all that we can without devolution, has really shown itself to be impactful. And the other thing I would say is that we talk a lot about Manchester and Manchester's successes. Manchester started at this point, and quite significant work has happened and contracts have been devolved from this as a starting point.
Okay, and how is this going to look in terms of reoffending rates? What's the impact of devolution going to have?
It's a good question, and those performance indicators will be one of the key things that will have to be looked at as part of signing off that MOU in June. I mean, from my perspective, the focus and concentration on cohorts is really important to us. So what I'm not going to say is that a devolution deal for London means that reoffending rates will drop by 20%. That's not realistic in terms of the challenges that we have around current services, the budgetary challenges we have, and the sheer volume we have in London. I do think that we are confident, as are our partnerships in London, that if we focus on specific areas and target and work better together, we can deliver better outcomes. So thinking again about female offenders, prolific offenders, we would want to see successes in those areas linked to a reduction in reoffending. I'd also just like to make the point though that from our perspective it is also about the victim. So we're really interested in how do we improve the quality of services and what victims in London are telling us as a result of any changes to services too. So it would be a combination of those two things.
Lovely, thank you. And then just to the rest of the guests, do you support the idea of devolving some powers and responsibility of criminal justice to City Hall? Have you got any concerns about it, or do you see there'll be benefits? I'm going to start with the Commander. Neil.
Yes, thank you. It is supported by us. One size does not fit all, simply put, across the nation. London does have, it's complex, it's got some unique issues, clearly. And being able to have a flexible fleet of foot arrangements in place that allows us to focus on what's occurring here, I think will give that local autonomy to those organisations to work through what's best for London as opposed to trying to make it fit to a national footprint.
Okay, thank you. Helga, Linda?
So we have a contract with NOM, so they're our primary client. So that's kind of where we currently sit. Certainly, I enjoy a very good relationship with MOPAC and see there is an absolute advantage of working in a London-centric way.
We obviously operate to a service level agreement with NOMS as well, but anything that most of what we do is within a statutory framework. But if, in terms of the London picture, if devolution would help provide a better service to service users and victims, then absolutely we support.
Lovely. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I mean, it's interesting, the conversation about devolution. I share Caroline's concerns. We've been talking about devolution for some years under the previous administration. The announcement yesterday is to be welcomed, but it was very high level, and I think we'll be very interested in the June 17 memorandum, which will by then be in the second year of this mayor's term and his police and crime plan. Anyway, moving on to support for short-term prisoners. There's clearly an issue around there. Nearly 60% of offenders reoffend within 12 months. And Keith, you've got one or two questions around this subject, I believe.
I have indeed, yes. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. No, good morning still, just. First of all, I'd like to talk about the work that NOMS has done to increase its understanding around short-term prisoners. There seems to be a number of issues, and certainly in London, an undesirable cycle of short-term sentence, release, not working well with the services probation, then there's a recall and another short sentence, another release. Seems to be, and a recent report said, you know, the release, recall and recall is a poor outcome for offenders. And I just wondered what NOMS has done to increase its understanding of how short-term prisoners are responding to supervision. Anyone like to picture that? Perhaps MPS, yeah?
What NOMS has done to understand short-term prisoners?
Yeah, what work has NOMS done to increase its understanding of how short-term prisoners are responding to supervision? Because it seems that the outcomes aren't very good at the moment.
Well, the legislation, the Offender Rehabilitation Act was introduced, and that brought that cohort of offenders into supervision. So they will receive 12 months, not 20 months, 12 months of supervision post-release. But you're absolutely right that some of what we see is that revolving door syndrome. It's manifesting itself in a slightly different way. They're just on the books now. Previously, they weren't being supervised. I think we've done the work we're doing is to try and, one of the challenges is to try and understand the difference between a license period and what is the post-sentence supervision period, and what constitutes, what can and can't be done in that period, what's commensurate with their offending, their behaviour, and what's legal even. And I think the work we're doing is to try and better understand, from the NPS point of view, is understand our cohort of offenders. We do have a small cohort of offenders in that bracket. Trying to understand their needs better. We are looking actively at alternatives to recall where appropriate. We've introduced, for example, London was one of the pilot areas. It's now been introduced nationally. The ability to vary licence conditions locally. Previously, we had to go to prison governors to do that, a bit of a more bureaucratic process. We can now do that locally. Local heads of clusters, senior managers can do that locally. So we're exploring different ways to try and address the recall issue. But it's just one I don't mean to make it smaller than it is, but it's one cohort of offenders amongst everybody else, and we will do the same with everybody and try to understand what their needs are and how we come up with them better. But the recall issue we definitely are addressing.
So you are changing processes, but really the question was, what are you doing to understand what are you doing to understand how prisoners are responding? I mean, are you looking at the psyche? Are you looking at why we've got this continuous revolving door, as you quite well put it, actually? You know, yeah, we can try different things, but often it's trying to get inside the psyche of the people that makes a difference, isn't it? What are you doing on that?
Sure. The evidence base is quite strong in terms of reducing recidivism and reoffending. We're talking about the specific cohort of offenders. So we've just rolled out, in response to the HMIP, in the MPS, we've rolled out, one of the responses is a performance and quality action plan, but quality development officers who will do some quality assurance work. Now, one of the things they will do, amongst many others, is try and understand our cohort of offenders better and exactly the issue that you refer to. But I think it's still early. We haven't got the evidence right now in terms of the short-term this cohort of offenders, whether their needs or whether the reasons for them reoffending or this revolving door is different to anybody else. I suspect there's probably subtle differences, but I don't know what they are right now. Is it about availability of services in the community? It may be. I think the resettlement piece, the through the gate piece in terms of how we work with them in custody is an important factor as well. It's a number of things, but I think, again, it comes back to us working together, especially with the through the gate piece, to really understand what those needs are. But I think it's a work in progress. We don't have the evidence right now to say, well, this is what we've done and this is what we've found, but it's a very good point you make.
Right, so has anyone else done any work on this at all?
I'm very happy to speak to principles of Through the Gate, which we're contracted to deliver. So the principle, transforming transforming rehabilitation introduced the concept of through the gate. Although having said that, a number of governors were very clear prior to TR that high risk period of somebody leaving custody in the first 24-48 hours post release, they're very, very vulnerable. So any motivation for change they may have had can disappear within those first 48 hours. So what the CRC is contracted to do is work with people when they come into custody at the very beginning to help assess needs and work with them in their last 12 weeks prior to discharge.
I'm actually going to ask, the next question is actually going to be about giving an example of effective through the gate provision and what it looks like in London. So you might as well roll that into what you're saying now, really.
So we work with them in their last 12 weeks prior to discharge, and then put them in touch with and make an attempt to try and get the offender manager who they'll be working with in the community to start building that relationship with them prior to release. So the aim being a continuity of relationship, which helps to bridge that kind of vulnerable few days post release. Where that works well, it's still a very early service, so it's been in place for approximately a year. We deliver that in two different ways across London. We deliver it self-delivery in the women's estate, and we deliver it through our service, through a supply chain in the male estate. And so we've got some very strong.
Sorry. I don't understand a word of that.
So we.
I'm a bit simple. So if you could just explain that, you said one was self-delivery and the other one was something
so
else.
we employ our own London CRC staff across the female estate, the 3 prisons just outside London, and they deliver through the gate services. So what that means in reality is they meet with people who are about to go out on release, and they talk to them about things like education, training, housing, and do what they can to signpost them, resolve any issues they might have around tenancies, that kind of thing. And then we work with third sector partners in the male estate. So third sector partners who we work with include Penrose, Catch-22 and Novus. So we subcontract those services. And some of those services, and there are some examples of very good services so Catch-22, for example, in Feltham, work very, very well with the young men coming out of Feltham.
Some of them aren't very good.
The varying quality. You asked me for an example of good practice, and I probably would pinpoint Catch-22 in Feltham. They are very well established. They have very, very good relationships with the young people there, and so building those relationships prior to release and going into the community has been something they've been able to do very positively.
Right. Okay. Still doesn't really answer the question about understanding them, but anyway. In the Chief Inspector's and Probation report, it says that services were poor and there was little to commend. But the mitigation there was that, and as you talked about education and accessing services, that you're not really in direct control of a lot of that, the education and housing and that. So what are you doing to build bridges with these partners, in housing, education? Clearly, if someone comes, as you said, people are very vulnerable for the first 48 hours, and if they haven't got a home to go to, I think I would feel quite vulnerable myself, and then if they can't access the education or can't access employment. So what do you do prior to their release in order to facilitate that so they don't just walk out into a very hostile environment?
Yeah. So using housing as an example, one of our we subcontract to St Mungo's, which is a housing charity, and we St Mungo's workers work in the prisons that we provide services to, and they're able to offer specialist housing advice. But what we don't have is housing stock to be able to give people on release. So we are absolutely reliant on working with other voluntary sectors, with local councils, to work with them to try and either kind of secure tenancies or try and find accommodation for our people when they're coming out of custody.
So what happens if you can't? And how often is it that you can't?
So we have a service level target that we are asked to find 90% of our service users accommodation that lasts at least 3 months, and we are around our average across all of the London estate is about 80 at the moment. So there are a number of people who are coming out without accommodation.
The 3 months bit, say that again?
So our target is to find settled accommodation for people coming out of custody for a 3-month period.
Right, all right, so you find them accommodation as they come out for a minimum of 3 months?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, sorry, I just couldn't quite understand.
Yeah, so at the moment, across London, our average is around 80%. So there are some areas where it's harder to find, and some cohorts where it's harder to find accommodation for people, and others where it's more straightforward. But it's a huge challenge, and it's a challenge that's not unique to service users across London.
So what you're saying is that 20% people fall through that net.
Mhm.
What's in comparison to the 80% that you find a home for or accommodation for, and the 20% that you don't find accommodation for? What are the comparative reoffending rates for those two cohorts?
I don't have the specific data on that, but what I do know is that accommodation is an absolutely critical part of helping address someone's offending behaviour. So you made the point yourself that if you were coming out of custody without anywhere to live, you would feel incredibly vulnerable. And we understand that that's a really important part of trying to stop offending.
So what are you, or are you dealing with the MPS or MOPAC together? What jointly are you doing to mitigate that situation?
So we are having we have conversations on a local level. So our local offices and our local relationships are talking to local councils, and on a pan-London level, I'm having conversations with local council, with London councils and council leaders about what they're doing around housing provision. But as I would say, it's not unique to service users across London. There's a dearth of
highlighted this dilemma to the MOPAC?
Yes, yeah, and when we met at the Justice Matters meeting last week, this was one of the key issues that we discussed as a challenge for London.
Right, so what's MOPAC?
Sorry, what's MOPAC? So what's my answer in terms of the 20%, or my answer in terms of the need?
Well, we know the need, so...
I mean, I think this takes us...
Well, can I ask you first, Matt, can I ask you, when was this brought to your notice? Was it only last week?
No. So, I mean, I think in terms of, if our focus is on reducing reoffending, I think that we know that there are a number of distinct, what are called pathways in terms of offenders, that are a priority if you want to impact on reoffending rates. Housing is one of those. Physical and mental health would be another one linked to substance misuse.
Sure.
And there's others, debt management, employment, I think there's 7 key pathways that as a strategic partnership we would look at and be kind of aware of in terms of each of the areas. So when I talked before about the cohort groups, in our work with each of those cohort groups is taking into account a need for remains a need for better data around which offenders are not currently able to access the required support, whether that be housing, mental health support, physical health support or employment. And we're working through the London Reducing Reoffending Board to do that. And that kind of needs picture has always been a key part of data that we have looked at in terms of performance for London. The other bit that I would say which is really important is when we were talking about local IOM arrangements, this is exactly what local IOM arrangements are supposed to be about. So the reason the 32 boroughs come together once a month and talk through their list of offenders when they're being released from prison and what their needs are and why probation would be present at those meetings and the police is to discuss then with the local authority how they can meet those broader needs. So housing are generally present at IOM meetings, so are substance misuse services, and so would health colleagues be there.
So do we have good boroughs and naughty boroughs then?
We have inconsistency across boroughs, and I couldn't tell you in terms of each of those pathways whether which boroughs are better performing than others. Housing generally follows the housing trend in terms of when you're looking at central London boroughs, it will be far more challenging in terms of accommodation across the board than it will be potentially in some of the outer London boroughs.
How long have we known about this housing thing?
I mean, housing as a pathway, a priority need for offenders has been the test of time, really. It's always been an issue because there's two elements.
I must admit, I couldn't have been doing my job properly because no one ever mentioned it to me.
Well, there's 2 elements to the housing need really for offenders. One is that when you go into custody, so into prison, particularly for those actually on short-term sentences, what often happens is offenders will lose their housing arrangements because nobody will tell somebody that they're not there to pay their rent. So there's some very kind of practical things that happen. My view is actually the fact that short-term sentence prisoners now receive supervision it will go some way to help with that because we actually know they're in prison and we know when they're coming out, which we didn't know as local partnerships before. So that problem has always been present, and you know, for 20 years I've been involved in this area of work, and when I've worked on local boroughs and sat in IOM meetings, it has always been a need that has been discussed. And I think aligned to that, though, there's a bigger piece of work, which is one that links the devolution question, really. So, you know, what are the benefits of devolution for London? One of the benefits are that if we were working and understanding better the contract value and the payments around the CRC contract, we have a closer relationship with London boroughs than naturally the MOJ would have. So that ability then to put in place formal agreements around housing and access to pathways potentially becomes slightly simpler. I'm not saying it's easy at all because there's 32 of them, but slightly simpler. So we don't have those formal agreements around access to housing or prioritisation of any particular offender into housing for London.
Couldn't the mayor do that though? Even though you know he, at the moment that sort of responsibility blah blah hasn't been resolved. Hasn't been devolved.
Mm-hmm.
The mayor has got, which is quite right to say, the mayor's got far more influence with the boroughs than MOJ or.
Yeah, and that data and those conversations are happening and being presented. There's no requirement placed on the local authority to provide accommodation to offenders. That's our absolute fundamental stumbling block. That work that we talked about, though, in terms of encouraging and funding integrated offender management programs locally.
But the mayor has tremendous leverage with boroughs.
Yes, and we're starting to apply a lot of that.
And it can't be hundreds of people, can it? I mean, how many people get released per year from prisons?
I don't know that figure off the top of my head, but there are on average 40,000 offenders in London.
Right.
And every one of those offenders, I'd go as far as saying, will have complex needs in terms of either physical, mental health, housing or substance misuse.
It's about just over 100 per borough then, isn't it, if you average that out? If you say 40,000 people were being released a year.
I don't know whether it's being released. There's 40,000 offenders either in custody or being managed in the community on average every year in London.
Right. So only a percentage of that we release them, wouldn't they?
So, for example,
We must have a ballpark figure.
generally a local IOM scheme will be managing something between 100 to 200 offenders, dependent upon what they've prioritised locally and what their list looks like. Every one of those offenders will have some sort of housing need, just as an example. And so if you take that volume, which is actually quite significant then when applied to the broader housing issues that will exist in every London borough, certainly at the moment as well, and has got worse over the last 5 to 6 years, there will be a pressure. So just as an example, MOPAC have agreed and done some work recently to put in place a reciprocal housing agreement for victims of domestic violence. Right. So just to put it into context, victims of domestic violence up until that point received no priority through local authority housing for a move. It had to be linked to some other broader need that was prioritised within housing options. So if that's your starting point, that a victim of domestic violence doesn't have prioritisation for housing, then starting to look at offenders becomes much more complex and complicated. So from my perspective, we're doing two things. As Helga said, we talked about this a lot at Criminal Justice Matters, and housing leads within the GLA were present in those discussions. We're working with London councils through the Housing Directors Group in terms of that data and that need. And we're working through local IOM arrangements in terms of continued funding support for local authorities to continuing to engage, because the key thing is it's not a statutory requirement placed on a local authority to reduce reoffending. So therefore we have to work with them in good faith to develop those partnership and those arrangements to support the pathways.
Be in the interest of a local authority to reduce reoffending, because if they live in their borough and they reoffend, chances are it's going to happen in their borough, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think, and my experience is that most of those two boroughs would agree with that. It's then actually making that practical, so turning that into agreements around access and support for those offenders that becomes very complicated. And, you know, in the last 8 to 10 years, the budgets around substance misuse and supported housing and all of those things that we had in local areas has been significantly reduced. So we've got severe probation changes and transition mixed with local authorities managing what's their sort of core minimum requirements, largely linked to statutory responsibilities that they have to deliver against.
Yeah, but as I think I said earlier, and I will shut up in a second, the mayor has tremendous leverage. You know, it may not be that the mayor can help them with providing a house, but certainly most boroughs want something from the mayor. There's always a quid pro quo in relation to the mayor.
And we are committed to working on that, and as I said, that's part of the conversation that started at Criminal Justice Matters 2 weeks ago.
That's where the deputy mayor could really, you know, have a conversation with the mayor and say, look, I need some housing in X borough. and the mayor can say, well, actually, X borough needs what's it. So, you know, it's life, isn't it?
And those conversations, as I said, have started, and those commitments around housing and pathways for reducing reoffending are in the draft police and crime plan.
Yeah, and then MOPAC itself, MOPAC, I can't remember what it's called off the top of my head, but MOPAC itself gives a not insignificant grant to every borough every year, I believe.
Yeah, the London Crime Prevention Fund.
That's the one. Yeah.
That's continued at 72 million guaranteed over 4 years to the 32 boroughs, and we do fund. That's why that's the funding I was referring
what I termed a naughty borough. We could say, well, you know, scratch your backy.
Well, I think that
I
funding
don't
is
think
in
we
place
need to
to do a
continue.
number
I
of
mean,
different things.
the point has been very well made by Keith, and I think that's well worth exploring it.
Yes,
Thank
the
you.
leverage.
Just to give some comment around the Justice Matters, apparently around a third of the people seen rough sleeping had at some point been in prison, but only 3% of these people had come straight from prison. So it suggests that people leaving prison, this was from your, I don't want you to comment on this because we're running out of time,
Sorry.
but only 3% of these people have come straight from prison. It's interesting because it suggests people leaving prison may have had housing provision for some time, but then became vulnerable rough sleeping ladies. This is the MOPAT rough sleeping programme. Right, I'm going to move on because we're moving on time. I know we're going to lose at least one guest who's going to meet His Royal Highness Prince Charles around 12:15. So I want everyone to pick up a gear if possible. Flo, you've got some questions around female offenders.
Just following on from support for short-term prisoners, and we know that a number of female offenders are short-term prisoners, with a number being sentenced for less than a year. And just looking at the support that they receive, how do you feel, what impact do you feel that the Transforming Rehabilitation Programme's had on women offenders?
Shall I start and then we can carry on? So I think what Transforming Rehabilitation has allowed us to do in the CRC is to focus quite a lot of energy and thought into managing women offenders. So we have women-specific teams in each borough who are working specifically with women in the community, but also linking in with the Through the Gate activity that I described earlier. And we have a commitment to setting up and extending women's hubs across London. We currently are supporting 2 women's centres in conjunction with MOPAC. So the Women's Centre in Hammersmith, it's run by Advanced Minerva, and the Beth Centre. And we are supporting a number of women's hubs and the growth of women's hubs in London. So we're supporting one in Sutton, Hackney, I've just opened one in Islington. So, and we're working in close partnership with MOPAC to carry on extending that and looking with interest to what's happening in Manchester and across the rest of the country. So I think the point we were talking about earlier around aura, I think that's probably had a bigger impact on women offenders, because as you point out, many women offenders are sentenced to less than 12 months in custody and are being subject to supervision in the way they hadn't been before and hadn't been used to being before. So I think my kind of ask of NOMS, and I think we'll certainly do some internal research on this, is what impact aura is having on returning more women into custody. And I guess the question we would pose is, are they being returned to custody necessarily, or could we be doing other things with them in the community?
You cited the work on women's specific teams and the women's hub. So my understanding was that there was the 3.78 million provided by NOMS. That was specifically ring-fenced for women, but now there isn't such a fund. So how are these provisions funded?
So we're funding those from within our own budget. So we talked earlier about reducing reoffending, and we have a payment by results mechanism. So where we understand that interventions work, and certainly I'm of the view that women's hubs work for women, we are investing in those, and we're supporting MOPAC in doing that as well.
Is there anything you want to add in to John?
I mean, our aspiration, we have 600 women, so that's 4% of our caseload, 300 in the community at any one time. And our aspiration is absolutely to have gender-specific interventions and space, and to work alongside partners to achieve that. I think one of the things, there has been a gap in the last few years since TR on that front, and we're absolutely committed to try and we get there again in the space.
Okay. In terms of, from the MOPAC perspective, Samantha, do you feel that the needs of women are being met by London CRS and MPS?
I'd go as far as I say I don't think the needs of female offenders in London are being met by any of the statutory agencies currently. I think that, as Helga said, the changes through TR and the focus on women has actually been extremely helpful and a good step forward. I'm personally a big supporter of having short-term sentenced offenders on supervision, because it means that we know where they are, we know when they're being released from prison, and in terms of supporting the community and rehabilitation, that's a really important factor. That obviously is a slightly separate point to how many end up then for being recalled back to custody. I think the work that MOPAC is committed to is that we know that far too many female offenders in London, so the figures I've got, that 78% of female offenders in London are serving short sentences of less than 12 months. That's not acceptable, and that more women end up in custody for short sentences than men. And we also know that when put on licence, they are more compliant than males in terms of adherence to licence conditions. So all of the evidence tells us that we should be doing something better. We have in place, from MOPAC's perspective, two things. Firstly, we've been funding for the last 4.5 years the Best Centre and the Minerva Centre in the Tri-Borough, which are both excellent examples of good practice in terms of addressing women's needs. I think they both provide support in terms of now the formal supervision process, but most importantly they provide the informal support that's needed in terms of the repercussions of female offending in terms of family life and all of those things. So that's the first thing. Secondly, we've put in place a really good starting point, which is what I would call it, which is the co-commissioning activity that is set between ourselves and CLC. So we've invested £500,000 to uplift and develop those centres so that 10 other boroughs in London can be direct beneficiaries of those services. And I say starting point because it really is a starting point. We've also got agreed, though, across London, we have a female offender strategy group that sits behind the London Reducing Reoffending Board. That's an excellent partnership. We've got very good voluntary sector representation as well as statutory services on that. And the MOJ are also partners of that group. And we've agreed through that group what the London vision is around female offending services in terms of a whole systems approach, which starts with police custody and hopefully ends with prison, but certainly with what happens after prison. But that investment around the co-commission services is really very much the first phase of putting that whole systems approach in place. I think the key thing to note is, firstly, London needs investment to support an immediate uplift in terms of provision and services, which is something that Manchester benefited from criminal justice reinvestment monies about 6 years ago. And secondly, when we talk about devolution, this is a critical point for us, and we've expressed that to MOJ, that joint investment and joint work around female offenders is something that we want to see progressed very quickly through the MOU.
Because of those stats on the length of sentences that female offenders receive, do you think that a lot more needs to be done in terms of restorative justice, which I don't know if all of you did see the report by the Restorative Justice Council last March, which was actually highlighting the fact that a number of female offenders aren't actually asked, and there's a presumption that they wouldn't like to apply for restorative justice. Has there been any work, additional work that any of you know that's going into looking at maybe that's a route that we should be pursuing for female offenders?
I mean, there's two things. Firstly, we have commissioned a restorative justice service for London, which has been doing quite significant consultation both with partners in terms of service providers, but also with both offenders and predominantly victims in terms of how RJ could be more effectively used in London. The primary focus of restorative justice is obviously the support to the victim and outcomes for the victim. But I do think that when we look at the cohort of female offenders, we know as well that data tells us that a huge proportion of those offenders are also victims of crime. And we need to think within that context, I think, just more strategically about what is the offer and interventions that we make available based on that gender-specific point that was made earlier. And I think RJ potentially does have a place there, but I think there's lots of other different types of interventions that we should be considering that are specific to women and what women's needs are as part of the criminal justice system.
And Helga, just on that, in terms of the specific needs of women and a range of additional needs that they'll need whilst they're in custody, do you feel that the officers have the right level of skill and understanding to actually deal with female offenders?
My officers, yes, and that's one of the reasons why we have women-specific teams, so we can build on that knowledge and that understanding and offer training specific to that group of women. And we have adopted a trauma-informed approach, which is the an approach that really tries to get underneath the kind of the root causes of many of the behaviours. So as Samantha alluded to, a lot of the women in the criminal justice system are victims themselves. So understanding the root cause of that is at the centre of our training and how we prepare our staff to work with women.
Just finally, obviously we've cited the police and crime plan and the support being offered to women. How do you think that the success will be measured in terms of if that actually works? Women offenders and the service that they're going to be receiving.
Sorry, so in terms of devolution or in terms of the police and crime plan?
In terms of the police and crime plan.
I think we need to see, we hope to see, success for me looks like a number of different things in terms of female offenders. So there's the obvious point around a reduction of their reoffending. But for me, it's also about the engagement in those services that they are referred to, whether it be as part of their licensing conditions or as part of, broader diversionary work that happens following sentence. The other piece for me that is really important in terms of success is the approach that we've agreed as a London Partnership is about a whole systems approach to reducing female offending. And most importantly, that's also when women come into police custody. So one of the key areas for success for me is that we're not charging women that don't necessarily need to be at that point charged. We are making sensible decisions based on risk as well as the support to the individual about whether they should be referred to other services at that point before entering the system. So for me it would be, what does success look like at each point of the journey for that offender? It should be what happens at the point in which they come into police custody and reducing the number of women that are actually entering the system. And then for those that are in the system, ensuring not only that we reduce their reoffending, but also that we address their needs. And just to go back to that point around victimisation and offending, I see that as critical to success around women in terms of female offenders. We need to understand that we have helped them to be able to cope with the challenges that they have so that they don't resort back to offending, which is thinking about them as victims in terms of things like domestic violence, sexual violence, and also other crimes that are linked to male offending patterns.
Definitely. And on that, what are the timescales for the Mayor's Female Offender Service in terms of when that will be rolled out, and how long is the programme going to be?
I mean, the broad timescale is within the time frame of the police and crime plan. What I'd be more than happy to share actually with the committee is what we've agreed as a broad outline of that in terms of the whole systems approach to female offending. Within that, we have included our ambitions around the time frames, the different phases of rolling out a whole systems approach across London, because we have to take into account both the geography and the different elements of the service. I would say one thing though, that in terms of the agreement of the MOU, by June, as part of the devolution piece, we would want to see certain elements of that aligned in terms of the timeframes around the MOU. So they might slightly change depending upon what comes out of that agreement. But I'd be more than happy to share that.
Yeah, I think that would be helpful.
Thank you. Before we move on to the next set of questions, which is about voluntary sector engagement, I'd like to welcome the teachers, boys and girls from Oakfield Preparatory School from Dulwich. And thank you for sitting there listening attentively. I hope you can stay a little bit longer. Well done, guys. It's great to see you look very smart in your uniforms. Today we're talking about people who've gone into prison and then have come out into the community, and how they're kind of looked after and made sure that they then don't perhaps commit any other crimes. It's a really good meeting. I'm really pleased you've come along and spent some time, and welcome very much to City Hall. So thanks very much. Really do appreciate it. Hope you have a great day, whatever you're doing with the rest of your day. So,
Steve, could I just say welcome as well? My children, both my daughters go to Oakfield, so...
And, right, is your daughter there?
She's not, no, she's too young. Maggie's in year 3, so, but welcome.
So
this is more challenging, Steve, than the committee now.
Yeah. It's obviously a fine establishment to send your daughter to.
Yes.
Okay, great, okay.
So tell Maggie I did a good
very
job.
important parent here. Okay, right, Sian, let's move on.
Okay, thank you. I have questions about the voluntary sector. They start off to the CRC and NPS, actually, because the government did announce that it was going to make voluntary sector engagement and the delivery of services via the in collaboration with the voluntary sector, a real part of its new plans. So my first question is, how is that going? How much engagement do you have with the voluntary sector? I think as private companies, you perhaps aren't used to that as local authorities. How is that going?
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. So part of TR enshrined with that was a commitment to work closely with the voluntary sector. So we work with the voluntary sector as part of our subcontracting arrangements, and examples of that are I've already mentioned Catch-22, Penrose, St Mungo's. So we have a number of voluntary sector agencies that we work with, and we require them to provide services on our behalf, and we're very happy with that. So that happens on a pan-London basis, and then locally we engage with the voluntary sector to try and source local provision.
Can you possibly go into a little bit more detail about that? I'm just thinking about, you've got the big, you mentioned St Mungo's, but also Catch-22.
Yeah.
Those are quite different organisations. Catch-22 is very specific to a particular prison, in fact, isn't it? Whereas St Mungo's operates at a quite national level. Are you finding it easier to engage with the larger charities and voluntary sector, and less easy to engage with the smaller ones?
I think it's fair to say that the voluntary sector have been on a kind of a journey as well through TR. So I think and certainly some of this has been difficult for them as well. So many of them have had to think about service provision and working within a contractual framework in a way they may not have had to do previously. And some have responded much more in a more kind of nimble way than others. But part of the responsibility we have, again, in the contract is a kind of market stewardship responsibility. So we've got a requirement to kind of nurture them through this, and so invest in kind of working with them to produce management information, trying to kind of get them to the point where they are able to work within this new contractual framework. And you're absolutely right. There are some organisations like Catch-22 who are very comfortable, and there are others who have required a bit more nurturing along the way.
Okay, can I ask the same questions?
Well, two things. I mean, the first thing is we're very clear that our service users are citizens and they're entitled to the same service as anybody else. And so our first port of call is always to tap into those services whether they're voluntary or statutory. And most of our work happens on that local level. So local boroughs will work to see what services are available. That might be SPOC champion officers who will do that work. It might be senior managers who do some of that work. And we've got some very good examples from employment training availability in Southwark to a local football club coming into waiting rooms in South East London. And then in addition to that, we don't really have those formal, what Helga describes, although we may purchase some of those through contractual arrangements, but we don't actually, one of the barriers we do have in this field is information sharing, which we find time and time again. People are willing to offer services or they have money to offer services, but we don't have information sharing, and that becomes a hurdle. So this thing to overcome, but mainly what happens is our engagement is at that local level.
You don't subcontract in the same way. Can I ask again, CRC, are there any particular voluntary sector sort of areas that are finding it more difficult to get involved? I know we've been talking to women's services, domestic violence services, who operate and look after specific groups, often ethnic groups, and they struggle to get funding. They're not very well resourced, but they're very, very important because they're the only people that some women will go to for help. Is it similar? Do you find that you have certain sort of specialist groups that are difficult to reach, that you're struggling with employing?
So we set up our subcontracted arrangements right at the beginning of TR. So those arrangements are pretty much in place. And what we haven't done, with the exception of some of the work we've done with MOPAC, what we haven't done is gone back to the marketplace and talk to other voluntary agencies about joining us, because those were very well established. Those were established quite early on. But you've talked about women's services, and both Samantha and I have worked very hard to engage with local women's services, because we're also cognizant that there are some very local specific services in the community that we don't want to lose, because they're addressing very specific needs, and we've worked to try and set up a London Women's Consortium to deliver services for women through, and my point earlier about having to nurture some of those services to a point where they understand contractual commitment is something we've been working on for kind of probably 2 or 3 years.
Could MOPAC maybe?
Yeah, if that's all right. I think there's I think that some of this is related to TR and the kind of commissioning and supply chain arrangements around the CRC, but also more generally, I think it's just related to the way that funding is going out to the voluntary sector. So one of the key challenges around that supply chain is the way in which the payment comes from the MOJ through to the CRC and then out to the providers. Those challenges are not dissimilar to some other commissioners and funders, which also pay either based on results or outcomes. And that's just a very challenging thing for some smaller organisations within London's communities. Having said that, what I would say is that through the work that we've started to do, female offenders is a good example, we have worked with the current commissioning arrangements, supply chain arrangements that are in place with the CRC, but by being able to work more locally with the London boroughs, we're starting to have those conversations about which services locally could we be funding to be engaging in that programme of work, which quite frankly is slightly simpler than thinking about how that works with the CRC supply chain. So part of me and Helga coming together is to bring together forces, if that makes sense, to make sure that where we've got the specialist skills and we want to develop that model over the next 3 years, we are making sure that we give them the best chance they have of working within the context of those delivery arrangements. I mean, outside of that, the other thing I would say is that there are challenges that have come into play through TR just generally, which are national challenges about voluntary sector engagement into what is deemed to be private sector companies and PBR arrangements, which are just an ongoing challenge. But I think in London we've got a good starting point now. You know, the Female Offender Strategy Group that I referred to has 7 or 8 women's services represented on that board, and some of those are in the supply chain but the majority are not, and the purpose for having them there is to challenge me and Helga continually about how are we bringing in resources to support the model that sits outside of either our money or so basically sits outside of statutory money that comes from charitable organisations to help develop that, or secondly how are we making sure that our money is helping develop and continue to sort of, I suppose, honour the specialisms that we know that we need to reduce reoffending.
Can you describe how the London Crime Prevention Fund fits into that?
Yes, so the money that goes out to the 32 boroughs. So on that, in terms of that fund, I'm a funder, not a commissioner. So simply put, we provide quite simple guidance to the London boroughs about what the fund is for, which is largely the delivery of the police and crime plan, working